So yeah, this is our fourth and final AAWT planning session. In the past three, we covered navigation and water management, gear, blisters, and environmental best practices. The recordings for all these are up on YouTube. And today we're going to be talking about resupply options. As with the last sessions, we'll stop for questions at the end of each section and then also at the end. And so you can ask a question by popping it in the chat. I think there's a raise hand button, or you can just jump in as well. Cool.
Can I just quickly ask, when you search on YouTube for, say, like I'm interested in that navigation one, what are your keywords?
The Adventure Gene planning session. It's on our website as well.
Oh, okay. That's cool. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, it might be hard to find on YouTube.
Yeah, we don't have a massive YouTube presence, but yeah, you can definitely find it on our website under the AAWT section.
Right. Okay. Cheers.
Cool. All right. So, the AAWT is quite unique in the space of long distance hiking trails in that resupplying is much more difficult than, on a normal trail. On a normal long distance trail, you'll come across a busy road and you can hitchhike into town, or you'll walk into towns and, you tend to not really have to do a lot of planning or preparation or put a lot of thought into it. You can just rock up on day one and generally make it up as you go along. That is typically not true on the AAWT. And so this is because it's quite remote and it doesn't actually directly pass through any towns. So given these limited resupply options, most people, they choose to place food drops, or they meet a friend or family to top them up with supplies. So today we're going to start by running through an overview of the towns that you can detour into, and then we'll move into talking about food drops, where we'll talk about what you should put in your food drops, where to place them, collecting them, and we'll also run through some of the options for companies that have popped up who are offering to place food drops. Finally, at the end, we'll run through 3 recommended schedules that we think are the best option for resupply based on different sets of needs. Oh yeah, and Adrian, thanks for popping the link in.
Great. So broadly along the AWT, there are around 5 convenient towns that you can detour into to resupply. So these are Mount Hotham, which is about 243 kilometres into the trail going south to north, Walhalla to Thawa, and that's about a 2.3 kilometre detour along a road. Then shortly afterwards, you have Falls Creek, which is a bit further to walk into, 6.4 kilometres. But you can also hitch into Mount Hotham and Falls Creek as well, because they're quite popular roads. Then there's the option to detour into Omeo at approximately 317 kilometres into the trail, but it's quite a substantial hitchhike. It's about an hour's drive. Then a bit further into the trail again, you pass Dead Horse Gap, where you can head into Thredbo, and that's quite a nice detour. You can walk along the Thredbo River Valley track, or you can hitch along the road again. And then finally, you could hop into Adaminaby, which is another hitchhike, about 30 minutes, and you do that from Kyandra. So these are kind of the most convenient towns to pop into. There are probably others that you could hitch into that are a bit further away. But the really important thing to recognise with these towns is that they're quite small. Hotham, Falls Creek and Thredbo are ski resorts. So I know Hotham in particular, a lot of things are closed over summer, but the grocery store is definitely open. But the main thing to note about these is because they're quite small rural towns, the grocery stores might not be fully stocked with all the foods that you might want. So it's certainly possible to resupply at the grocery stores in these towns if you're flexible with what you want to eat. But for people who have dietary requirements, it might not have everything that you need. So the other options in terms of resupplying in towns instead of going to the grocery store is you can post a parcel ahead of time. And that could be to the accommodation you're staying at if you're staying in the town, or maybe there's a post office, things like that.
Oh, and something that we forgot to mention is that we have just done a massive revamp of the resupply section of our track guide. And so all of these details and numbers and everything are on the in the resupply section of our track guide on our website. So yeah, you don't need to like take down any of these exact numbers or, you know, names or anything. It's all there.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So what if you are going to place a food drop, what are you going to put in there? I mean, obviously the first thing is food. But then once you've put in the amount of food that you think you're going to need, for us, we would recommend at least 800 grams of like dry, high calorie food per day. Once you've put in the amount of food you think you'll need, you will want to put in extra food. Because what will happen, or what can happen, is you might be walking slower than you expected. There might be a weather event that slows you down. You might have an injury. You might be hungrier than you thought. It might turn out that like you couldn't stomach another packet of 2-minute noodles and that you just couldn't possibly like bring yourself to carry it out from your food drop. So it's always worth putting in more food than you think you'll need and of a broader variety of types. The thing with the Alpine track compared to other trails is that in general, the stakes and consequences of decisions are higher. You know, because it's remote, because there aren't a lot of people on the track, you know, you, you chances are you're not going to see someone else who can like bail you out if things go really wrong. Like it could just be you out there. So this is why you need to make sure you've got enough spares of everything, especially food. The next thing is water. And so especially in the southern third of the trail where you can place food drops, there isn't necessarily running water there. And it might actually be in a pivotal spot that can massively reduce the amount of water that you have to carry between sections. So yeah, really making sure that you put enough water in, and then, you know, whatever you think you need, just double it so that you definitely have enough. You know, maybe you end up camping there overnight or something like that. And then, you know, just other things like fuel if you're cooking. So consumables, things like sunscreen, stuff that you need to look after your feet, uh, insect repellent, that type of stuff. And the experience that we have from doing food drops both on the Alpine track and on other trails is that you don't know what you're going to need ahead of time. And so it's generally better to overpack than underpack, because the last thing that you want, especially on like a tough trail like this one, is for you to realize that you're ripping through these, like maybe you're using heaps more moisturizer than you normally are using, and you didn't know that ahead of time because you haven't done this track before or something happens. You really need to make sure you have enough of this stuff, because if it's another like week or two until you can get to a town like Thredbo or Hotham, you know, it can just save you a lot of misery. The other thing is to think about spare shoes. So most people will walk this whole trail in a single pair of shoes, and that's fine. Like you can totally do that. But if you consider the relative cost of the whole, like the cost of doing the whole trail, the amount of time and energy and effort that you're putting into this track, you know, we would really recommend thinking about swapping shoes, you know, halfway through the track, halfway in terms of time, not necessarily distance, because what we see quite often on long distance trails is people will start getting injuries a couple weeks into the track, and they'd been going really strong up until that point. But what's happening is their shoes are flattening, and then they're getting like athletic injuries that could have very easily been prevented if they were in fresher shoes. Compare the cost of shoes to having to spend a day or two in town because you were injured or something like that. It's like a really easy thing that you can do to prevent problems. Another big challenge for this trail is managing your power. And so the places where people will most likely be going into town to charge everything up is Mount Hotham and Thredbo, which are roughly 1/3 and 2/3 along the trail. But apart from that, chances are you're running off the power that you pick up from your power banks or from a solar panel. We personally haven't found a solar panel that we think is worth the effort whilst hiking. And so that means that you're running off the power that you put in your drops. So just you can get some cheap power banks off eBay or something. Or don't do that, because if they die, then you'll wish you'd bought an expensive power bank. But again, it's one of these things where you really need to make sure you have a suitable buffer, because maybe you're doing heaps more nav than you thought and you're running through power. Maybe you accidentally left your phone on off airplane mode, or all of these things can happen. And just having these redundancies, you'll just feel a lot more secure when you're out on the trail, knowing that you have these redundancies in your drops. And then finally, just personal medications. Yeah, if something happens, you just want to know that you've got backups. So I guess the whole mindset is quite conservative. And it's a real, if you're doing quite a few food drops, it's a real challenge to organize it all and to lay it all out and make sure that it's correct. But it's one of those things where the more preparation that you do beforehand, the greater chance of success you're going to have. Because a lot of people on the alpine track, they have problems because they get injured or they have foot problems. And a lot of these things could have been mitigated by doing better preparation, particularly in reducing your pack weight and making sure you have the kit that you need to look after yourself. And a lot of that stuff we've talked about in the last few sessions. Does anyone have any specific questions about what to put in a food drop? Nope.
More what the food drop container is made of, as in vermin-proof type product.
Yeah, so we're going to get to that in a little bit, but we can talk about it now. What you put the food in, I mean, like the cheapest option is to go to Bunnings and get those big plastic containers with the sealable lids. And then once you've popped the container, once you've put everything in it, you tape the lid tight so that like ants and stuff don't get in there. And then you can pop it in like a black garbage bag so it's more camo. And that's what we've done. You can go more expensive and buy like big metal containers and stuff, but we've found that plastic tubs are fine. Josh, cool. Josh has asked a question: have you had any issues with storing power banks in food drops and losing charge? So that's something we've never had an issue with. It's a really good point. That's something that you need to consider. So generally you'll get this discharge occurring when something is plugged into it. What you might find, you might reach your food drop, and if it's really cold, you might think that it's dead, but then once it warms up a little bit, it will be fine. So we personally haven't had any issues with power banks in food drops either being hot or cold. As Adrian has asked as well, if there's any issues with the batteries in the heat. The main thing with batteries in the heat is using them when they're really hot. And food drops, typically they actually stay reasonably cool because you place them in the ground somewhere in the shade. Yeah, we've never really had any issues with batteries being too hot or too cold.
I guess that's why you put spares in case something does happen.
Yeah. But, you know, I mean, we've done a lot of food drops, but doesn't mean it can't happen.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions about popping stuff in food drops? I think for a lot of people, electronics is the big headache. Cool.
All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about now is the process of actually placing your food drops. So there are a few things to keep in mind when you're putting your food drops out on the track. And first of all, a really important thing to be aware of is the road access and the conditions of the roads that you'll be driving along to place these drops. So over winter, some roads are closed. So depending on when you plan to hike the Australian Alps Walking Track, you might need to put your drops in well in advance.
It's typically June till October, and on our planning guide, we have for the drop places that we have listed, we have when those roads are closed.
Yeah. And other than which roads are closed and when, the other thing to bear in mind is the condition of the road. And obviously this varies year to year depending on the level of maintenance and how much rainfall there's been. So it's always a good idea to check out the current status of the road before you go out and drive along them yourself, especially in four-wheel drive territory.
Or if you're trying to take a two-wheel drive in four-wheel drive territory.
Yes. Then the next thing is when you're placing your drops, making sure they're well hidden. Because of how vital these drops are to your hike, you really don't want anything going wrong. So it's really important to make sure they're well hidden. It'd be really nice to think that if someone came across your drop, they wouldn't tamper with it, but you just never know, and you really don't want anything going wrong because a drop going missing or being tampered with could be the end of your hike realistically, or you might need to spend days heading out into town to fix that problem. So it's a really good idea to hide them really well. And what we find is, or what we like to do is we like to put them in black garbage bags, like Tom said before, to keep them a little bit more camouflaged. And similarly, Tom mentioned earlier the animal protection, getting these big plastic tubs, they're pretty strong and they generally work really well, we find. And we like to tape the seams, like Tom said, to stop little bugs and insects getting in. And finally, the other thing to bear in mind when you're placing your food drops is we'd really recommend putting some sort of label on your drop just to give people who might stumble across it a bit of an idea as to what it's doing there. So the things we put on our drops are, our name, the date we place the drop, the date we're going to be collecting the drop by, which is really important because you don't want someone removing your drop if you haven't used it yet. We also like to put some contact details of a non-hiking family member or friend who will have very stable service and will be able to answer those calls if someone does want to contact the person who put in the drop. And then also your intentions, so just something like AAWT food drop, so that people know what it actually is.
And I had a food drop once that was removed, and then the person, once for some reason they didn't look at what it was, but then when they got home they realized what it was. They called the person whose phone number I had on the box, and then they sorted it all out and then arranged to come meet me like a day later or something.
Yeah.
Whereas if there was no information on it, it would have just been gone.
Yeah. And then collecting your food drops, obviously you just want to quickly mention that you always need to collect your food drops after you finish your hike, and the earlier you do this, the better.
Yeah, it only gets harder as you get less motivated to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Are there any questions on placing food drops or collecting food drops?
Yes, I'm wondering, do you usually put a pin in your app to
Yeah, great question. That is something we should have mentioned. We always place a waypoint on our navigation app with the drop location there.
And a photo.
and a photo of where you placed it. So if it's camouflaged in some bushes, it's really great to take a photo and draw some arrows on your photo pointing to exactly where that drop is. That is a really great point. Thanks for bringing that up.
And even just a little bit of a description as well. And when you save a waypoint, take two, because it's possible that your GPS isn't fully locked, and you take one, it might not be correct the first time, and if you take a second one, it just kind of gives you that sense of like if there's an error scale in your GPS.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So each to their own, but I'm curious as to what app you use.
The navigation session is awesome for all of that.
Okay, all right.
But
Yep.
We like to use Gaia GPS or Map Out.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Cool.
Great.
So one of the big things that is changing the way that you can consider doing your resupplies is by using a company to place the drops for you. And so these were the three that we could find online. And we personally haven't used any of them, but we think that it's a great idea. And we'll get a bit more into that when we talk about our recommended schedules, because for this track, depending on how you want to approach it, it might be that you actually only really need to place 1 or 2 drops. And if you can pay someone to do that, instead of having to, spend a whole weekend driving or spend 3 days driving and then having to pick them up later, like that could be a really high value proposition for you. And so the way that these food drop companies typically work is that you will post them, like a lot of your dry food and your first aid supplies and that type of thing. And then they can top that up with like heavy food that they can buy at the supermarket. And they'll also put water and fuel canisters in. And then they'll place the drop, and then they'll also collect it. And I think the collecting aspect is something that really needs to be emphasized, because it's not an option to just place the drop and then not collect it. But the collecting doubles the amount of work that you have to do. So, yeah, we'll get a bit more into this soon, but it's something that we think could be a really good option for a lot of people if it means you don't actually have to drive and do any food drops. Cool.
Yeah. Great. So we will now touch on some of our suggested schedules that we think work really well depending on different circumstances. So the first one we're going to talk about is a schedule that involves no driving, no putting drops out for yourself, and really the least amount of effort in terms of preparation.
This is what we would do.
Yeah, this is what we would do. So with no driving, you can resupply at Jameson-Lacola Road, and that's where you can pay one of these companies to put a drop in for you. Then the next place is Mount Hotham, where you can walk or hitch into Hotham, go to the grocery store, or have posted a parcel there ahead of schedule. Omeo Highway, hitchhike into Omeo, same deal, grocery store or a posted parcel. Then the same at Dead Horse Gap, where you walk into Thredbo, and then the same again at Kyandra, where you can hitch into Adaminaby. So for this schedule, the longest carry is around 150 kilometres between Omeo Highway and Dead Horse Gap. But I will say that we think that this first drop location at Jameson-Lacola Road is really important. It is obviously one that you have to pay someone to do for you, but we wouldn't recommend walking from Walhalla to Hotham with a single food carry, because that is generally renowned as the hardest section of the trail. So it's really great to be able to break that section up by putting a drop in at Jameson-Lacola Road, which is why these companies can be really great for that if you're coming from interstate or you don't want to spend the time to drive out there yourself. The other thing to note about this schedule is it obviously involves a bit of hitchhiking. If that's not something that you want to do, then it's quite straightforward putting a drop in yourself at Omeo Highway and Kyandra. These are both sealed roads and open all year round. So that does involve a little bit of driving on your part, but it is by far the simplest and easiest food drop schedule to implement.
I guess one word on hitchhiking, in that it can seem really intimidating if you haven't done it before. I have personally done both of the hitches. We hitched into Adaminaby late last year, and then I've also done the hitch into Omeo. And the Omeo one is harder than the Kyandra one, but they're both doable. And for us, if it's like, if it's either, spend an hour waiting at a road to get a hitch versus having to put food drops in, we would much prefer to like try get a hitch. I can understand that for people who are doing it solo, maybe that's something that you're not super sold on. But we'd strongly consider it, because it's something that it can often result in a lot of great experiences. You meet really cool people, and it can often just be some of the most fond memories of the entire track are the people that you meet because they decided to stop whilst you're sitting on the side of the road. And Matthew's asked a question if Jameson Lacola Road is rump saddle. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. And so what I'm going to show here quickly is, so this is a map that we have put together that is on in the resupply section of our planning guide. And what you can see here is we've got the whole track broken down into the Chapman sections, and we've got all of the different places where we think you could put a food drop or resupply. And specifically, if you're struggling to visualize these options, we've broken it down into the 3 options that we're going to present. So here is the first option, the one that we were just talking about. If you're like, oh, where are all of these roads? What does it look like? You can see these are the points where we're looking at resupplying. And then if you want to do, the second option that we talk about, or the third option, or you're not looking at doing one of the options that we've cooked up, you can also just say, okay, well, what are all of my options? And that's all in on the track guide.
Yeah.
Anything else about this one?
Are there any questions about this resupply strategy?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the hardest bit, like if you're implementing this, you could really consider walking north to south, because the hardest resupply section here is between Mount Hotham and Jameson Lacola. Even though the distances are a little bit higher up here, this will probably end up being the days where you're like, oh, I really wish my pack was lighter. Cool.
Great.
I just popped something in the Q&A, but I'm not sure if it's working.
Oh, Q&A.
Is that where you ask questions, or
how much would a company? Yeah.
Yeah, you can do it either way. Thanks for pointing out that you put something in there. So Bob has asked, how much would a company charge for a food drop, say to Jameson Lacola Road? So the ballpark figure is usually between $400 to $500 per drop. It depends on the company.
And that's for like 2 people or something.
Yeah.
So, if you were getting 8 drops placed, maybe you're like, that's a whole lot of money. But if you're like, oh, my real problem resupplying is just between Walhalla and Mount Hotham, and if I get this 1 drop put in at Jameson Lacola Road, and that solves all of my headaches, maybe that's, and then you don't have to do any driving, and you don't have to pick any drops up, then for us, that's when it becomes a really compelling option.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So the next one is if you're like, okay, that's great. That looked like a good resupply option, but you're set on doing food drops and you have a two-wheel drive. And so your question is, okay, well, how can I really reduce the amount of weight that I'm carrying to give me, the best possible chance of finishing or the most comfort? Or if you're looking at maybe moving a little bit slower. So, this just, if you're wanting to reduce the amount of food you have to carry. If you've only got a two-wheel drive, this is what we suggest, but it still involves getting a company to place a drop at Jameson Lacola Road. I mean, because you really don't want to be taking a two-wheel drive up there. The other thing to note is that some of these roads are two-wheel drive accessible, but as we mentioned in the planning guide, it's two-wheel drive. Some of these are two-wheel drive in dry weather. So if you're planning to do your food drops and there's 50 mil of rain forecast for that weekend, well, that's probably not a good food drop weekend. Because roads like the Pocket Saddle Road, Benambra Corryong Road, I mean, these are all, dirt roads where, these three are dirt roads where if you've got a two-wheel drive and the road's in bad condition and it's rained heaps, you could easily get into trouble.
Yeah.
Cool. This is also good, if you're not keen on hitchhiking at all. And the longest section, what is it? Which one is it? It's about here. It's about 100.
Benambra Corryong to Dead Horse.
Yeah. Oh no, this one's 130. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, this is still the hardest section. Does anyone have any questions about this option? Cool.
Great. And we'll finish by just talking about, if you have a four-wheel drive and you want to reduce your pack weight even further, this is a schedule you could look at doing. It basically, it doesn't include paying someone to do it for you, because if you have a four-wheel drive, you can put a drop in yourself at Jameson Lacola Road. And it also adds this Camp Creek campground and Co-Wombat Flat, which just breaks up a few of those longer sections of food carries. So for this schedule, the longest carry is about 114 kilometers from Dead Horse Gap to Kyandra, but all other carries are less than 90 kilometers. So again, that's not always indicative of how many days it's going to take, but it's a good idea as to it's a good schedule to consider if you really want to reduce your pack weight as much as possible without, putting a drop in at every single possible location.
Yeah. I think for us personally, anything more than 7 days of food feels like a lot of food to be carrying. And so if you're looking at this itinerary and you're going, oh, that's going to be a 12-day food carry, if you want to do that, that's fine. But we would, it might be worth thinking about putting an extra drop in to cut a 12-day carry into a 6 and 6, because you definitely meet a lot of people out on the AAWT who have like a 25 kilo pack because they've got, 18 kilos of food with them or something obscene. Yeah. The other thing to note here is that this Camp Creek campground is driving up Mount Speculation Road, and that is one that you really want to only do if you've got a proper four-wheel drive and you know how to use it. Because you see Subarus up there, but sometimes you see Subarus don't make it up there. Cool. So yeah, I guess those are the three options that we think are the most compelling for people. And like we showed on the map here, we kind of have all the different options listed. And so with the map, we've also got a list of all the different places that are also in the map with the coordinates, their distance, the access type, and then just any other comments about when it's closed or anything else. Adrian just mentioned that if you're wanting to put a drop in at Camp Creek, you could park at Lake Cobbler and walk it in. That's totally true. You could also do one on the other side near Vallejo Gantner Hut. Can't remember how to pronounce that one, but that's the other option if you're really looking at breaking that carry and up.
That's a fair walk in though.
That is a fair walk in, but you can get in there with like a Subaru.
Yeah.
I think the main thing for us that we really want to convey to people is that we feel that one of the main reasons that people don't do the Alpine track is because the resupply is too difficult. To organize all the drops, to place them, and to collect them. It's a lot of effort. It's a big time commitment, especially on top of the time commitment of actually doing it. And so that's why we think that that a no driving option is really compelling, because here the longest food carries for a lot of people will still be 7 days or so, and then if you have to pay like $400 or $500 for a food drop, but you don't have to do any driving, I think that makes a lot of sense to us.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Does anyone have any questions or anything that they wanted to add?
I was just going to ask, how much of the day is taken up hitching into Omeo and getting back?
It can depend. It can vary a lot.
Yeah.
So when we were hitchhiking into from Cayandra into Adaminaby, we got a lift in 5 minutes, but then it took us, I think, an hour to get a lift out the next morning, because we stayed in Adaminaby overnight. For Omeo, I mean, you don't want to be turning up at the road at 5 o'clock, or without, like, you want to leave a couple hours of daylight to give you the best chance.
Yeah, I think for us, when it comes to reducing the amount of time it takes to get a lift into a town, it's you want to obviously have a bit of a hiking element going on. People who know your hikers, they're generally, from our experience, they're more willing to stop for you because they understand what you're doing in some regard. Maybe not so much for this track, as not everyone knows about it, but at least that's definitely the case on other trails.
Yeah.
But there's also an element of, making sure that it's easy for them to pick you up. So you want to pick a good spot on the road where they can pull over. You want to make sure that they can see you as they're coming along, so they have time to pull over, and you want to present yourself in a way that's not too scary, because as you're hiking, you're pretty messy sometimes and a bit dirty, and it's important to not give them any reasons not to stop for you, if that makes sense. But that being said, letting it be known that you're a hiker has usually worked in our advantage.
Yeah, definitely. And the other advantage that you've got going for you is that if you're in a really remote place, you look a lot more desperate, and so people will stop because they're concerned that you're okay. And then once they stop, then once they stop, they're not going to keep going. Or some will, but not many.
I'm sure it looks pretty obvious what's going on.
Yeah.
Then would you recommend spending the night in the towns that you hike to, if that was the case?
Yeah.
It's up to you. If you're, it's nice spending a night in the town, and it's a good way to refresh yourself after a few days hiking. But it really depends on your circumstance, and maybe the road is, swarmed with cars in the afternoon, and it's a really great opportunity to hitch out. Then maybe you just take that opportunity straight away and you don't wait until the following morning. It kind of depends on the scenario.
Yeah, so Jay, we'll get to your question in a second, but I think this is the other point that I forgot to make earlier that your question, Darren, has prompted me on, is that one of the other reasons we really would try promote the option of hitchhiking into towns or not preparing all your food beforehand is that what food you think you will want can be very different to the food that you actually end up wanting. And that, like, I guarantee you that if you place 6 food drops, by the time you see your 6th food drop, like, you don't want to see it. You're like, not like whatever you put in there, it's just going to be more of the same crap that you've been eating for the last month or 2, depending on how long you're taking on the trail. And being able to go into a supermarket and just buying like 4 liters of ice cream and a chocky milk, and then going to a restaurant and ordering a pizza, and then carrying another pizza out on the trail to have as breakfast next morning. Like, if a hiker comes across you and you're eating a pizza, like, you're the king. You're the king of the trail. So there's like a massive mental boost of going into towns. And one of the reasons people struggle on the Alpine track is because it is so remote and there are so few people. And, that's, but if it's been raining for the last week, maybe it's actually really nice to go into town as well. So, I think that that's something that we should have mentioned earlier. So yeah, Darren, if it's like midday and you get to the road, unless you're like really trying to smash out those miles, I would definitely consider just chilling in town and trying to get a lift out in the morning, because these are quiet country roads. A lot of the lifts that you'll get will be like people going to and from work as well. So that's worth considering. Anything?
No, that's
Does that help, Darren?
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you very much.
Cool. And so we had a question from Jay about Pocket Saddle Road, asking if it's a public road, and if you can drive up to the track junction. So I'll actually get it up here. So with Pocket Saddle Road, this is actually a really nice spot to do a drop if you want to break up the carry between Tharwa and Kyandra. And the road is public. You can drive up to about, I think it's about here or here. I think, yeah, in the track notes, what do we say? It's, oh no, we need to put the walk-in distance, but it's like a 1 kilometer walk or something. But it's publicly accessible most of the way. But this is one of those roads that is closed over winter. So between the June and October long weekends, you can't get in there.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Did anyone have any other questions about food drops or just anything? Awesome. Look at that. Snuck in under an hour again. That's good. That's better than the water management one. Great. Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. I think that, yeah, that was our final planning session. So you're all officially fully planned.
Thank you, guys. Fantastic.
Cool.
Okay.
All right. And yeah, make sure to shoot through any questions or if something's unclear.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy
Cheers.
the rest of your weekend.
Will do.